All right, so it's been 2 weeks. We had finished the last time we were together looking at the first half of Job's final words. And Job's final words that we had considered for the previous few weeks had to do with his friends. We had heard him finally get the opportunity to just tell them that he's done with them, done listening to their advice. They didn't understand what comfort was. They were supposed to be his friends, yet they offered him no comfort in his circumstances. They didn't understand God, although they represented God in their words, or so they said. They didn't understand what integrity was, because if they did, they would have saw that Job was truly a man of integrity. Integrity is not who you're at every day. It's who you're at when you're under pressure, when you're suffering. And here Job was in immense suffering, and still he was the same man that he always was. He didn't let the suffering change him. They didn't understand judgment. They kept thinking that Job must be wicked because he was suffering. That must be God's judgment on Job. They only stood judgment in this life. Job understood that the true judgment comes when this life is over. And they didn't understand wisdom. All three of them shared where their great wisdom had come from what they had experienced, what they had seen, what they had read. But none of it was true wisdom, because true wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. And true wisdom comes from the Lord. So we finished looking at chapters 26 through 26 through 28. Tonight we're going to start chapter 29. And Lord willing, we will get through chapter 29 and 30 this evening. Sounds like a lot, but it moves kind of quickly. These final words that Job shares before we meet a new individual, a new friend that has some things to say, these final words of Job returns to where he was at when his friend showed up. If you remember, he had just experienced all this loss. And he was sitting there with boils covering his body, with ash upon his head, scraping those boils with a piece of clay pot, and just mourning and lamenting. He just wanted to get it off his chest, what he was feeling. He wanted to tell God what was going on in his head and in his heart. Not that God didn't know, but sometimes it just feels better to say it. And that's where Job was when his friends all showed up and started accusing him and arguing with him and all kinds of stuff. So Job, in these last words, is going to return back to that lament. He's going to return back to where he's just going to pour his heart out, where he feels like he's at right now. And he's just going to share what's going on. And he just wants to pour out his heart in his suffering. And chapter 29, chapter 30, and chapter 31, each individually have their own point. He begins in chapter 29 by basically saying that his suffering was unexpected. It was not something that Job saw coming. Now, if you're a wicked individual, you should expect God's wrath to be poured out on you. You should expect trouble and trials to come your way. But Job, he was a godly man. He was a man that God declared being righteous. So Job starts off basically just saying, I didn't expect any of this. There was no reason for me to feel like this was going to happen. So let's start by looking at verses 1 through 11 of chapter 29. It says, moreover, Job continued his parable. And he said, oh, that I were in past months as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, when I washed my steps with butter and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. When I went out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the aged arose and stood up. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouths. The nobles held their peace, and their tongues cleaved to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. You can almost hear Job talking here and saying, I remember the good old days. I remember when I was walking with God and God was just so good to me and everybody knew that I was right with God. The people that saw me knew I was a godly man. When people saw me, they revered and respected me for who I was. Oh, the good old days when all the blessings, when my children were still around me. He remembers those days fondly. And he feels like in those good old days, God was pleased with him because God was blessing him. And it was obvious to everybody around Job that God was blessing him. If you remember, though, back up. God was pleased with him. And the reason that Job had it so well was because God kept the enemy away. He kept Satan away from him. But if you remember, back in Job chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, that was when Satan came to God. And God had said, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says this. He answered the Lord and says, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. God had kept Satan at bay. He had kept Satan away from Job. He had built this hedge around Job, and Job was blessed. And like I said, Job knew he was blessed, and everybody knew Job was blessed. Now, the only difference now is God is still pleased with Job, but he has allowed the enemy, Satan, to afflict him. But Job remembers those good old days. He also remembers that he didn't use his prosperity as a means to grow apathetic. Job actually used his prosperity as a tool for ministry. Look at what it says in verses 12 through 17. Because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help him, the blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was a robe and a diadem. I was eyes to the blind, and I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. And I break the jaws of the wicked and pluck the spoil out of his teeth. See, Job knew that God was good to him and blessing him. And he knew that he was walking in right relationship with God. He recognized that all that God had given him was so that he could be a blessing to others. He recognized that God didn't just give it to him to heap it to himself. That God had given it to him so that he could care for others. And he says, that's what I did. When God was walking with me and God was pleased with me and he was blessing me and he was protecting me, I shared all that I had. I did what was right. I blessed the poor. I helped the fatherless. I did what was right. I protected the young. I cast out the wicked. I did what I should do for God. He was really in a good relationship and on the same page with God. And that leads to what Job says next in verses 18 through 20. Then I said, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My root was spread out by the waters, and the dew lay all night upon my branch. My glory was fresh in me, and my bow was renewed in my hands. So Job is looking back at how good he had it, and how he and God were walking together, and how he was doing what God would have him to do. And when it says there in verse 18, then I said, basically what Job has done is said, this is the way it's always been. So you know what? This is the way it's always going to be. He said in his head, this is what tomorrow holds. Are we supposed to do that? Are we ever supposed to take tomorrow for granted? Are we ever supposed to say, because God has blessed me today, I know tomorrow He's going to bless me as well? No. But he recognized that that's what he thought. He's looking back at the past and he's saying, before all this affliction came upon me, I had actually walked with God. I was doing what was right. And I had thought in my own mind going forward that nothing was ever going to change, that I was going to grow old in grace, and I was always going to have wealth and prosperity in my family and every blessing of God about me that I could share with everybody else. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Job's not the only one that felt that way. Everybody recognized that about Job. It's no surprise that they used to seek out his counsel and advice. Look at what it says in verses 21 through 25. Unto me men gave ear and waited and kept silence at my counsel. After my words they spake not again, and my speech dropped upon them. And they waited for me as the rain, and they opened their mouths wide as for the latter rain. If I laughed on them, they believed it not, and the light of my countenance they cast not down. I chose out their way, and sat chief, and dwelt as a king in the army, as one that comforteth the mourners. Job says, everybody around me thought that that was going to be my life. That I was just always going to have God's blessing upon me, that I was always going to have more than enough, that I was always going to be the guy that you went to when you needed help, when you needed counsel, when you needed anything. You could go to Job because Job's always going to be right there with God. He's always going to have everything that he needs plus. But it didn't work out that way. It didn't seem to anyway. Job had no warning. The suffering that came upon him was completely unexpected. Now, maybe we can recognize that in our own lives at times. Maybe sometimes things come upon us suddenly, and we feel like, wow, where did that come from? We feel like we've been doing what we're supposed to do and God's pleased with us and we're walking along and we're doing our thing, and all of a sudden trial comes our way or troubles come our way and it's unexpected. And we say, where did that come from? What caused that? But on a side note, honestly, for Job thinking the way he did, it was wrong. For us to think that way, that because we're right with God through his son Jesus, that we should never experience any kind of suffering is a wrong way to think. That we should never have any trials or tribulations is a wrong way to think, because Paul wrote to Timothy in his second letter, and he said in verse 12 of chapter 3, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ shall suffer persecution. All that live godly in Christ will suffer persecution. So if we are walking according to God, if we are walking in the Spirit, if we are living a life that pleases God, guess what? Expect suffering. Expect trials and tribulations. Why is that? Is it because God's displeased with us and he's pouring out wrath on us? No. But he allows Satan to. He allows Satan to work against us, to put trials and tribulations and troubles in our lives. Why? Because for the Christian, it actually purifies us. It helps us to draw closer to God. It strengthens our faith. But on Satan's side of it, think about it. If you're a so-so Christian and you're just kind of cruising through on autopilot, and you're not doing anything to please God, but you're not doing anything to displease God either. You're just trying to stay kind of in the middle. Don't want to do anything too radical. Don't want to make God too happy. Don't want to make anybody too mad. Just staying in the center there. Satan's already won that battle. Because you're not doing anything for God that you need to do. You're just trying to stay the course. You're just trying to walk the line. Not trying to do anything great. Not trying to do anything that's going to bring God glory. Just trying to stay under the radar. Satan's already won that battle. You're never going to do anything great for God because you're just down here walking the line. On the other hand, the ones that are out there trying to do great things for God, the ones that are out there sharing their faith, the ones that are out there reading their Bible and praying and being prayer warriors and sharing the good news and talking about their faith, those are the ones Satan says, I got to do something about that one. That one's a troublemaker. That one's going to keep spreading the gospel. That one's going to lead people to Jesus. I got to do something about that one. They're the ones that have troubles, trials, tribulations. And it's not from God. It's because Satan's fighting against them. And God's using it for His glory. So if you're kind of walking along and everything in my life is wonderful, maybe you need to look at where you're at. Maybe you need to examine your faith and say, am I really living for God? Or am I just living below the radar? It was unexpected for him. It came out of nowhere. But Job was a righteous man. And Satan attacked him. You notice who Satan didn't attack? Job's three friends. Bildad, Eliphaz, or Zophar. Why? Because they had this messed up theology. They thought that God blesses those that do good and punishes those that do evil. So as long as we stay here in the middle and do what's right, we're going to be fine. Satan wanted Job. All right. Chapter 29, suffering was unexpected. Chapter 30, his suffering is unexpired. It won't stop. There's no end in sight. Notice here that the suffering Job speaks of is a present suffering. He doesn't lament about the loss of his livestock. He doesn't lament the loss of his children or the pain of his boils. In chapter 30, he is looking at what is going on right now. Now, it looks like we're going to try and get through chapter 30. It's 31 verses, I believe, but we'll get through this. Let's read the first 15. But now, they that are younger than I have me in derision. Those fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished? For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time desolate and waste, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. They were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys and caves of the earth and in the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth, and now am I their song. Yea, I am their byword. They abhor me, they flee far from me, and spare not to spit in my face. Because he hath loosed my cord and afflicted me, they have also let loose the bridle before me. Upon my right hand rise the youth, they push away my feet, and they raise up against me the way of their destruction. They mar my path. They set forward my calamity. They have no helper. They came upon me as a wide breaking of waters. In the desolation, they rolled themselves upon me. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passes away as a cloud. In these first 8 verses of this, it describes men that are worthless, men who Job would have had no dealings with previously. These men are the dregs of society. And now those men, those very men that were the lowlifes of society that nobody would look upon, were looking down upon Job. Job had become for them a byword. They mock him. This is Job that walked with God, that everybody saw and knew that God was always going to be with him and bless him. Now these lowlifes, they look at Job and laugh at him and mock him. He goes on and says, these young men who may have looked to Job for leadership and wisdom, they now spit in his face. They cause him further suffering. It didn't just stop with all the calamity that had already come upon him. His suffering continues. Look at what Job has to say about this continuing affliction in verses 16 through 31. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. My bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. By the great force of my diseases my garment changed. It bindeth me about the collar of my coat. He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. So I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death and to the grave, though the cry is in his destruction. I jumped there. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. Howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Did I not weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? When I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. My harp also is turned into mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep. Do you hear what Job's saying? Verse 20, I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Job looks at God and he says, I've been crying out to you and you're not hearing me. When I stand up to try to get your attention, you don't even pay attention to me. Verse 24 says, howbeit will he not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in destruction? You hear Job, why won't you help me? Why won't you deliver me from all this? Verse 26, when I looked for good, then evil came unto me. When I waited for light, there came darkness. Job isn't talking about his initial affliction here. He's talking about how he expected God to come to his aid. God, I've gone through all this suffering. I've cried out to you. I've asked for deliverance. I've asked for help. I've asked for just your presence. You're not listening to me. I stand up. I can't get your attention. And the suffering just keeps going on. I seek good and I receive evil. Think about his friends again. You know, when your friends show up when you're down, you should be like, my friends, they came, they care about me, they love me, they're gonna comfort me, they're gonna be with me. And they came and they brought him lower. They didn't comfort. They just accused and beat him down. This is continued suffering. It just hasn't ended. And he feels like it's not going to end. At this point, it just keeps going. His pain just keeps on happening. It keeps getting worse and worse. And God has not shown up to give him any help. Sometimes it's not the initial suffering that's the hardest. We live in a fallen world. We know this. When we look around us and we see all the results of sin in our lives, consider the things we know. Because of sin, sin brings about death. Because of sin, part of death is growing old. Part of growing old is experiencing aches and pains and problems and trials and tribulation. We expect all that. It's when the suffering intensifies and keeps getting worse that we have problems. Job's looking at God and saying, when does it end? Haven't I suffered enough? And in reality, I think sometimes we look to God the same way when we're going through things. Think about it. When you have your children and you see that child fall and skin their knee and burst into tears, what do? Do you leave them there? Do you let them just sit there and cry? Of course not. As a parent, you run over, you pick that child up, you comfort them, you get them to stop crying, you clean the wound up, you put a bandage on it, you make them feel better. And Job says, God, where's my Band-Aid? It's not getting any better. You haven't come down, you haven't given me this hug, you haven't had me stop crying. The suffering continues. It just isn't right. And this is part of his lament. He just can't understand why it's continuing. It was unexpected in the first place. God, I was doing everything I was supposed to do. You were blessing me. I was blessing others. I was trying to be a good man for you, and I was trying to do what was right. And we had this thing, and we were walking together, and I knew it, and you knew it, and everybody else knew it. And then all of a sudden, whack! I lost everything. I got these boils. I got these friends that are worthless. And it was unexpected. And it hasn't ended. That suffering is still continuing. Why, God? Next week we'll finish chapter 31. We'll get to chapter 31. Chapter 31, Job basically asks, why? Because it's completely unexplained what he's going through. We'll get through chapter 31, and then the following week, Lord willing, we will meet somebody new. A man by the name of Elihu. There you go. For now, let's have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time together this evening, for prayer and for this Bible study that you've given us. Help us, Lord, to retain all that is useful concerning this story of Job, a righteous man suffering, Lord, beyond what he felt he could bear. I pray, Lord, that you would help us to be better comforters to those that are in need. And Lord, that we would learn from Job's mistakes, that we would not turn our wrath toward you. Amen.